Today we're going to talk about 2.5, the slave trade in the Middle Passage. If you look at the picture there, it just represents all of the slaves that came from Africa to the New World. Notice that not all the slaves came just to North America. Some slaves even went to South America in what was New Spain. So why did the South need slaves? So talking about the 13 colonies that we've already talked about, why did the South need slaves? And that's because of plantations. Plantations are where cash crops such as sugar, rice, or tobacco are grown on a large scale. So a cash crop, anything that you can sell or grow to sell and make money, not for personal consumption. A shortage of labor. Why was there a shortage of labor in the South? That's because plantations had first used Native Americans as workers, but European diseases had killed millions of them to where they needed somebody to replace them. They tried the indentured servants, but they were too expensive. We've talked about indentured servants on the last PowerPoint. So what started the slave trade? So Africa wanted guns from Europe, and that's what started the slave trade. So Africa didn't really have the ability to make their own weapons, and Europe did. And so Africa asked Europe, saying, hey, we need weapons if we're going to send slaves to the New World. So the slave trade, also known as triangular trade here, a trading network that carried goods and enslaved people between Europe, Americas, and Africa. So like I said earlier, Europe is going to send guns to Africa. Step 2 of the trade would be Africa sends slaves to America. And step 3 would be America sends more crops to Europe. And now the second step to this three-way trade is Africa sends slaves to America. Therefore, the second step is also known as the Middle Passage. So the slaves leaving from Africa, going across the Atlantic Ocean to the New World, that's also going to be called the Middle Passage because it's the middle part of the three-way trade. So here's the slave factory, which is Fort Elmina, and it is off the western coast of Africa. And this is going to be where the slaves, where they were shipped from, where they were put on a boat and then sent to the New World. So it was basically like a holding prison to where, they just held them there until they could get them on the next ship. So Middle Passage, the name of the voyages that brought enslaved Africans across the Atlantic Ocean to North America and the West Indies. It's called the Middle Passage because it is the second of the three-part triangular trade route. So notice, if you look at the picture on the left, okay, they're going to try to fit as many slaves on each ship as possible because the more slaves meant the more money. When they get off the boat, they're going to get auctioned off. And so if you can carry more slaves, you're going to make more money. And that's why they put as many slaves on each ship as possible. And, these slaves here, they're not just sitting there because they want to. If you notice in the picture of the right, they're chained down. And so they don't really have an option. So now this is underneath the deck of the boat. So it's dark. And if you could only imagine, how dirty it is here as these people sit here and, they're not going to get unchained to go use the restroom. It's going to be, very disgusting, very nasty. And many of the slaves are going to die on this voyage across the Atlantic Ocean. So here's just another picture here that represents how many slaves they're trying to fit on each boat and how they're going to try to put as many as possible so they can make the most money. So statistics on these slave ships, about 18 million Africans were transported between 1600 and 1800, with about 3 million dying on the way. So this is while they're crossing the Atlantic Ocean on the Middle Passage. About 3 million slaves are going to die. And when they do die, they're going to just take them and throw them overboard into the Atlantic Ocean. For as far as these trips, they're going to give them as little as water as possible, as little food as possible. They're just basically trying to keep them alive. They're really don't care about their comfort or how much nutrition they get, how much food they get. As long as they're alive when they get off the boat, that's really all they care about. So this journey lasts three plus months. depending on the wind and the weather, on how long it took to get from Africa. And most of these slaves were unloaded at Charlestown, South Carolina. Today we call it Charleston, but it was the farthest south port in the 13 colonies. So many of the slaves that came to the 13 colonies, most of them ended up in the port of Charlestown, South Carolina. So now at the dock, once they get off, the families are going to be broken up at auctions. So these slave owners would show up in Charlestown and basically buy these slaves as soon as they get off the boat. So as they come off, they'll basically line them up, and it's going to be a lot like people buy cattle. They'll bring them up, and you look at them and try to see which one is in good health, and the slave owners would have an auction right there in the streets or right there off the dock, and the males between the ages of 18 and 25 were most expensive because they were in their prime. They had a lot of life ahead of them. They were very capable of doing very physical labor, and also they were in the prime to reproduce. And so that's why males 18 to 25 were most expensive. But now women were also somewhat expensive depending on their age. If you could find a female slave that was in her late teens, early 20s, then she's going to be able to reproduce and make many more slaves in the future. And the cheapest way to get more slaves was basically having them reproduce. And so this could help the master's wealth by creating a bigger slave population. The elderly, the grandpa, grandmas, they're going to be the ones that are the cheapest because they're too old to work in the field, or maybe as an older woman you could work in the house as a cook or a server. As a older male, you would work in the field. If you couldn't do that, then maybe you babysit the young children that aren't capable, that are not old enough yet to work in the fields. So those would be the cheapest. And then you would have the children, who would be a little more expensive than them because they might not pay off right then, but later on they would hit their prime and be worth a lot more. So life as a slave. So where did slaves work? Majority of them worked on plantations in the South. Now understand that not all slaves worked in the South, and also not all slaves worked on plantations. Some slaves worked in mines, like iron mines in the middle colonies. Some worked in towns, even some in the North. So not all slaves were in the South. Not all slaves worked in plantations. However, majority of the slaves worked on plantations. Majority of them worked in the South. So women performed domestic duties such as cooks or servants. And then the African slaves taught the Americans how to grow rice. And rice became a large cash crop in America. And they had learned how to grow it in Africa. And then so they're able to bring it over. They have experience growing it. And they come to the New World in 13 colonies and show their plantation owners, hey, this is how you grow rice. And it became effective. The slave codes. Slave codes prohibit slaves from their rights. So these could include keeping slaves from learning how to read, keeping them from owning firearms, or marrying a white person. These laws also made it to where children born to slaves were automatically slaves for life. Many slave owners did not teach their slaves to read. And why? That's because plantation owners did not want to educate slaves because they feared a rebellion. Slaves outnumbered the whites in the South, and this was not even close. It's probably 20% white, 80% African Americans in the South where these plantations were. So these slave owners, they feared a rebellion from the slaves. That's why they couldn't own weapons. They didn't want to educate them because they knew that if the slaves were to fight back, and if they were educated, then it would be harder for the slave owners and masters, the plantation owners, to keep them from winning. And so there were stiff punishments for even the most minor of offenses. The penalty for a slave that was caught trying to read could have his thumb cut off. So just different things. And anytime a slave faced punishment for even the minor things, they did this punishment where everyone could see it, all the other slaves. And, it could be something very minor that you mess up on, or a slave, got caught doing. But when they punished them, they would try to set an example to basically put fear in the other slaves, to where the other slaves would think, there's no way I'm going to do that, because I don't want that happen. I don't want that punishment to be put on me.